Week after week, the old German shepherd performed his silent ritual. Every time the tide went out, he would go to a single, rocky outcrop, dig systematically, and bring back a piece of rusted metal. For the veteran, Elias Vance, it was just a harmless mystery that helped him forget the past. Until one day, the object the dog brought back was not metal. This time, wedged inside a broken fragment, was a military dog tag, a K9 tag. This discovery shattered the silence, turning a strange habit into a message from a tragedy buried for 40 years, and pulling Elias into the sights of those who would do anything to keep that secret from ever seeing the light of day. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence Elias Vance had chased all the way to the edge of the continent was a liar. It was not empty. It was full of the ghosts of sounds, the sharp crack of a rifle, the strained whine of a struggling engine, and worst of all, the final, choked-off bark of a friend. He had bought the old Port Blossom Lighthouse, seeking a quiet so profound it would deafen his memories. Instead, the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic against the granite cliffs below served as a constant, mournful percussion for the chaos that still replayed in his mind. Elias, at 42, looked every bit a man shaped by hard winds and harder years. He was tall and lean, with a wiry strength in his frame that had outlasted the softer parts of him. His brown hair, cut short in a way that needed no maintenance, was surrendering to gray at the temples, a silver frost that mirrored the sea foam. His face was a map of his past, weathered and lined, but his eyes, a deep and thoughtful blue, held a kindness that he himself had forgotten was there. He wore his uniform of self-imposed exile, an old brown leather jacket that had long ago molded to his shoulders, a plaid shirt of navy and muted beige, and a pair of faded denim jeans tucked into sturdy work boots. This was his armor against a world he no longer wished to engage with. Port Blossom, Maine, was a town that seemed to conspire with his desire for isolation. It was a place tucked away on the coastline, often shrouded in a thick, damp fog that muffled sound and blurred the lines between sea and sky. The year-round population could have fit into a single city block, a collection of tight-lipped fishermen and their families who measured strangers not in weeks or months, but in generations. They had watched him move into the decommissioned lighthouse with a quiet, non-committal curiosity, then left him to his solitude. The lighthouse stood on a spit of land, a lonely sentinel guarding a harbor that saw more lobster boats than cargo ships. It was perfect. It was a fortress of forgetting. But the forgetting never came. The ghost of his last partner, a magnificent Belgian Malinois named Ghost, was a constant presence. Ghost, with his intelligent amber eyes and unwavering courage, had been more than a K9 partner. He had been an extension of Elias's own soul. The mission that took him was a blur of sand, smoke, and a failure so complete it had shattered Elias's world. He had come home with a medal for bravery and a wound in his heart so deep that no amount of silence could heal it. The quiet of the lighthouse only gave the memories more room to breathe, to expand, until they filled every stone of the old tower. It was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into his new life, that he first saw the dog. The tide was at its lowest, exposing a jagged shelf of dark, seaweed-slicked rocks that reached out into the bay like skeletal fingers. From his vantage point in the lantern room, the highest point for miles, Elias had an unobstructed view of the coastline. He was cleaning the salt spray from the thick glass when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a German shepherd, a handsome, mature animal, with a thick coat of salt and pepper, gray and white fur. The dog moved with a purpose that immediately set it apart from any stray or pet out for a run. There was a discipline in its gait, a focused intensity that resonated with Elias's own training. It ignored the gulls crying overhead and the scuttling crabs in the tide pools. Its attention was fixed entirely on one specific spot at the base of the rocky outcrop. Elias lowered his cleaning cloth, intrigued. The dog, which he would later learn the locals called Echo, began to dig. Its paws worked methodically, sending sprays of wet sand and pebbles flying. It was not the frantic, playful digging of a dog chasing a scent. This was systematic. It was a search. After several minutes, it paused, nudged something with its nose, and then carefully picked up a small, dark object. From that distance, it looked like just another piece of rusted metal, the kind of debris that littered any working coastline. But what the dog did next was what truly captured Elias's attention. Instead of dropping the object or carrying it off into the dunes, Echo turned and trotted with that same deliberate pace toward the small, windswept cemetery that overlooked the water just beyond the lighthouse property. Elias watched, his breath held, as the dog navigated the old headstones, finally stopping at the base of a weathered stone statue of a sailor gazing out to sea. There, it gently placed the piece of rusted metal at the statue's feet, as if making an offering. Then, without a backward glance, it turned and disappeared down the coastal path. Elias stood motionless for a long time, the rag still in his hand. The entire sequence was so precise, so ritualistic, that it couldn't be random. As a canine handler, he had spent his life studying and shaping canine behavior. He knew instinct, he knew training, and he knew obsession. What he had just witnessed felt like a strange combination of all three. It was a ceremony, a silent, solitary rite, performed for an audience of none. The image of the gray and white shepherd, so steadfast in its mysterious task, stayed with him for the rest of the day. It was a puzzle, and his mind, starved for any distraction from its own dark corners, latched onto it. For the first time since he had arrived in Port Blossom, a flicker of something other than grief sparked within him. It was curiosity, and in the profound, lying silence of his lighthouse, that single spark felt like a distant, long-forgotten star beginning to glow in the darkness. The next day, Elias found himself at the lantern room window long before the tide began its slow retreat. A part of him was annoyed. This dog, this gray and white enigma, had breached the walls of his solitude without ever setting a paw on his property. It had planted a question in his mind that had taken root overnight, a distraction from the carefully curated emptiness he was trying to cultivate. But another, stronger part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades training and understanding the most disciplined animals on Earth, was hooked. The professional in him had been awakened. As if summoned by the clockwork of the ocean, Echo appeared on the coastal path at the exact moment the water reached its lowest ebb. The dog's movements were identical to the day before. The same focused trot, the same disregard for the surrounding world, the same destination, at the rocky outcrop. Elias watched, his blue eyes narrowed in analysis. This was not mere habit. Habit has variations. This was a procedure. It reminded him of Ghost preparing for a search, the way every muscle, every sense, would align with a single, overriding purpose. The memory brought a familiar ache to his chest, but for the first time, it was accompanied by a sharp, intellectual curiosity, rather than just raw grief. He watched Echo dig, its powerful shoulders working with practiced efficiency. It unearthed another small, dark object, held it gently in its mouth, and began the second leg of its journey to the cemetery. The initial flicker of annoyance in Elias had completely dissolved, replaced by a deep, professional respect. This animal was on a mission. Once Echo had vanished from sight, Elias made a decision. He went down to the small living area he'd set up in the lighthouse's main floor and retrieved a fresh notebook and a pen. He was a man who believed in data. On the first page, he wrote the date. Then, he started a log. Time of low tide, time of Echo's arrival, time of departure. He stared at the simple entry, a familiar process that felt both comforting and strange in his new, unstructured life. He knew he could not leave it at that. He had to see the evidence for himself. Pulling on his worn leather jacket against the cool sea breeze, Elias left the lighthouse and walked the short distance to the cemetery. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. The iron gate groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The place was old, with headstones leaning at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. He found the sailor statue easily. It stood on a small rise, its stone eyes fixed on the horizon, a monument to all the lives the sea had claimed. At its base was a small, curated collection of debris. Elias knelt, his knees cracking in the damp grass. He saw the piece of rusted metal from the day before. Next to it lay a corroded brass bolt and a small, twisted length of what looked like copper wiring. The newest addition, the one Echo had just delivered, was a flat, palm-sized piece of steel, pitted and scarred by the water, but with a clean, straight edge on one side. It was not a rock. It was not driftwood. He picked up the piece of steel, its cold weight surprising him. He turned it over and over in his hands. These were not random items. They were fragments, pieces of something man-made, something that had been broken apart with great force. A boat, perhaps, or something else. A quiet certainty settled over him. The dog was not collecting trash. It was recovering evidence. He carefully placed the piece of steel back with the others, feeling like he was intruding on a sacred site. That night, the past came for him with a vengeance. The day's events, the memories of training, the focused intensity of the dog had unlocked a door in his mind. He tried to keep bolted shut. He dreamt he was back in the desert, the sun a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. The air was thick with the smell of sand and diesel. He was with his unit, and Ghost was at his side, his body tense, his nose testing the hot wind. The dream twisted, the events of that final mission playing out in disjointed, terrifying flashes, the sudden, deafening explosion, the world turning to smoke and screaming, and then the image that would haunt him forever. Ghost, lying in the sand, his beautiful amber eyes looking at Elias with a final, trusting gaze before they went dark. Elias woke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape. The 4 stone walls of his bedroom seemed to close in on him, the silence of the lighthouse now a suffocating weight. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled out of bed and climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He needed air. He needed to see the horizon. He stood there, his hands pressed against the cool glass, staring into the blackness where the sea and sky met. The terror of the dream was still wrapped around him, a physical presence that made it hard to breathe. His mind was a storm of guilt and loss. Then, for no reason he could name, the image of Echo entered his thoughts. He saw the gray and white shepherd standing on the rocks, its body braced against the wind. He saw its methodical digging, its unwavering focus, its solemn march to the cemetery. He saw a creature with a purpose, a mission it performed every single day without fail, driven by a force he did not understand. The image did not erase the pain, but it gave his frantic mind something to hold on to. It was a point of order in the swirling chaos. The dog's steadfastness, its absolute unshakable discipline, was a small, solid thing in a world that felt like it was breaking apart. Slowly, his breathing evened out. The frantic pounding in his chest subsided to a dull, heavy ache. The dog was a puzzle, yes, but in that moment, in the deepest part of the night, it had also become an anchor. The week that followed settled into a new, strange rhythm, one dictated by the moon and the tides. The dog became the focal point of Elias's days. His notebook filled with entries, a meticulous log of Echo's unwavering dedication. The dog never missed a day. The tide would recede, and like a ghost summoned from the mist, the gray and white shepherd would appear. Each time, it would dig. Each time, it would find a new piece for its collection. A sheared rivet, a fragment of a gear, a piece of metal sheathing. And each time, it would complete its solemn pilgrimage to the sailor's statue. Elias's professional curiosity had now deepened into a quiet obsession. He no longer felt like a mere observer. He felt like a witness to something profound. The dog's ritual was a silent testament to a long-forgotten story, and Elias felt an inexplicable pull to understand it. The anchor that Echo's steadfastness had provided on the night of his terror had held firm. The nightmares still lurked in the shadows of his mind, but they no longer consumed him. His focus had shifted from the ghosts within to the mystery on the shore. On a gray, overcast morning, when the sky was the color of slate and the sea was a restless churn, something was different. Elias watched from the lantern room as Echo began its work on the rocky outcrop. The digging was more frantic this time, more urgent. Instead of a small piece of metal, the dog pulled a larger, chunkier object from the sand and seaweed. It was dark and angular, not like the other pieces. It looked like a broken piece of a box, maybe. Echo seemed to struggle with its prize for a moment before getting a firm grip. It then began its journey to the cemetery, its head held high, carrying the object with a sense of triumph. Elias waited, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He gave the dog a full 10 minutes after it disappeared before he put on his jacket and headed out the door. He found the new offering at the base of the statue, nestled amongst the other metallic fragments. It was, as he had suspected, a piece of a container. It was made of a thick black polymer, a type of heavy-duty plastic designed to withstand extreme conditions. The box it had come from had clearly been shattered, and this was just a jagged section of it. But wedged within the broken plastic, held fast in a crevice, was something else, something small and metallic. Elias knelt, his gaze locked on the object, his breath caught in his throat. With trembling fingers, he carefully worked the metal piece free from its polymer prison. It was grimy with sand and age, but as he wiped it clean on the leg of his jeans, its shape became undeniable. It was a dog tag, a military-issued dog tag. The world seemed to fall silent around him. The cry of the gulls, the crash of the waves, the rustle of the wind in the long grass, it all faded away. He was holding a piece of his own past, a relic from a world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. The tag was old and pitted from its long years in the sea, but the polymer casing had protected it from the worst of the corrosion. Stamped into the metal, faint but still legible, were the letters and numbers that made his blood run cold. He could clearly make out the symbol, K9. Below it, a series of numbers, a service identification. It was the tag of a military working dog, a brother in arms, a soldier, just like Ghost. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet washed over him. It was a complex storm of shock, grief, and a profound, aching sense of connection. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random piece of debris. This was a message. All the other pieces, the bolts and wires and plates of steel, they were just the preamble. This was the heart of the story. He stood up, the small metal tag clutched tightly in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the history and sacrifice he knew it represented. His curiosity had just ignited into a full-blown, personal mission. This was no longer just a dog's strange habit. This was a duty. A fallen K9 soldier deserved to have its story told. The loyalty that had led this dog, Echo, to perform its ritual day after day was a loyalty Elias understood in his very bones. It was the same loyalty that had bound him to Ghost. He looked from the tag in his hand toward the coastal path where Echo had disappeared. The dog was not just digging, it was remembering, it was honoring, and Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had to find out who this dog belonged to. He had to know the story behind the tag. He had to know the name of the K9 hero whose memory Echo was so determined to keep alive. The silence he had sought was over, replaced by the clear, ringing call of a new purpose. Finding information in a town like Port Blossom was a delicate operation. It was not a place where one could simply ask direct questions. Elias knew this. In communities this small and tight-knit, trust was a currency earned over decades, not days. His first stop was the town's only general store, a cluttered and cozy establishment that smelled of sawdust and coffee. He bought a few supplies he did not need, making quiet, polite conversation with the woman behind the counter, a sturdy, gray-haired woman named Martha. He did not ask about the dog. Instead, he asked about the coastal path, about fishing spots, and eventually, he casually mentioned the handsome gray and white shepherd he had seen walking near the cemetery. Martha's friendly expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That would be Echo," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He belongs to Samuel, lives out on the old coastal road, last house before the point," and that was all. The door to that conversation had been gently but firmly closed. The old coastal road was more of a glorified dirt track, winding precariously close to the cliff edge. The last house was a small, salt-bleached cottage that looked like it was in a constant battle with the wind. Its paint was peeling, and the garden was a wild tangle of seagrass and hardy salt-resistant shrubs. A plume of wood smoke curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of life. As Elias parked his truck and walked toward the front door, Echo appeared from around the side of the house. The dog did not bark or growl. It simply stood there, watching him with intelligent, unnervingly calm eyes, a silent guardian of its territory. The man who answered the door looked as weathered as his home. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with a face carved into a permanent scowl by sun and sea. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were narrowed with suspicion. He was stooped with age, but his shoulders were still broad under a thick, dark green wool sweater, hinting at a strength that had not yet entirely faded. This had to be Samuel. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough like stones grinding together. It was not a question, it was a dismissal. Elias held his ground, keeping his posture non-threatening. "My name is Elias Vance. I live at the Lighthouse. I believe this is your dog." He gestured toward Echo, who remained watchful but still. "He's not bothering anyone," Samuel grunted. "No, not at all. I've seen his routine, with the things he finds on the shore." Elias decided a direct approach was the only way. He held up the K9 tag, letting it catch the weak afternoon light. "He found this yesterday." Samuel's eyes flickered to the tag, and for a fraction of a second, Elias saw something shift in their depths. It was a flash of old pain, quickly masked by a fresh wave of anger. "That's just sea trash," he snapped. "The dog likes collecting junk. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm busy." He started to close the door. "Sir, this is a military K9 tag," Elias pressed, his voice firm but respectful. "It means something. The dog's behavior, it's not just a habit, it's a mission. I know the look of it." "You don't know anything," Samuel snarled, his hand tightening on the door. "Leave it be. Leave him be. It's got nothing to do with you." The door was about to slam shut when a new voice cut through the tense air. "Uncle Samuel, please don't be rude to our new neighbor." A young woman came around the corner, carrying a box of groceries. She looked to be in her late 20s, with the same pale blue eyes as her uncle, but hers were bright with intelligence and warmth. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and she wore a practical red fleece jacket and jeans. She gave Elias a friendly, apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about him," she said. "He's forgotten his manners. I'm Lena." "Elias Vance," he replied, relieved at the interruption. Lena set the box down on the porch. "I heard you moved into the Lighthouse. Welcome to Port Blossom. Is everything all right?" Before Elias could answer, Samuel cut in. "He's bothering Echo, telling me stories about sea trash." Lena's gaze fell on the tag, still in Elias's hand. Her expression shifted from friendly to intensely curious. "What is that?" Elias showed it to her. "Your uncle's dog, Echo, dug it up yesterday. It's a K9 service tag." Lena took the tag from him, her fingers tracing the faded letters. As a local historian, her mind was a library of the town's stories and forgotten facts. A K9 tag from an unknown source was not just an object, it was a historical anomaly. "Where did he find this?" she asked, her voice hushed with excitement. "On the rocky outcrop at low tide, he brings things back every day. He places them at the sailor statue in the cemetery." Lena looked from the tag to her uncle, whose face had become a stony mask. "Uncle Samuel? It's nothing, Lena. Just a coincidence," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lena ignored him, her focus entirely on Elias and the tag. "There are numbers on the back. Faint, but they're there. I have access to the town and county archives. I might be able to cross-reference them, see if anything comes up." She looked up at Elias, a new, determined light in her eyes. "I want to help." "There's nothing to help with," Samuel insisted, his voice rising. "Drop it, Lena." Lena turned to her uncle, her expression softening but firm. "Someone lost their partner, a soldier. That's not nothing. That deserves to be remembered." She then turned back to Elias. "I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can find. And him. Him, E5. An uneasy alliance was formed right there on that windswept porch. Elias, the quiet outsider, with a piece of the puzzle. Lena, the town historian, with the means to investigate it. And Samuel, the old guardsman, standing between them like a locked door, a silent, angry keeper of a secret he was desperate to protect. As Elias left, he knew his quiet life was over. The mystery of Echo had just found its voice. 2 days passed in a state of suspended anticipation. Elias found himself checking his phone constantly, a habit he thought he had left behind with the rest of his old life. He continued his daily observation of Echo, but now he watched with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a witness. He was a partner in the dog's solemn mission, waiting for the next clue to be brought forth from the sea. The call came on the third morning, just as the fog was beginning to burn off under a pale sun. "Elias? It's Lena. I think I found something." Her voice was crackling with a restrained energy that traveled right through the phone. Elias sat up straighter at his small kitchen table. "What is it?" "A ship," she said. "It took some digging. The numbers on the tag didn't lead anywhere directly, which is odd for military records. So I went at it from another angle. I started searching the town archives for any major incidents, shipwrecks, specifically, from around that time period. The tag looked like it had been in the water for decades." Elias listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "In the winter of 1983, there was a massive storm," Lena continued, the sound of rustling paper in the background. "One of the worst on record for this part of the coast. According to the official town report, a civilian cargo vessel named the Odyssey was lost with all hands. It went down just off the coast, not far from the point." "The Odyssey?" Elias repeated the name. It sounded mythic, tragic. "What kind of cargo was it carrying?" There was a pause. "That's the strange part," Lena said, her voice dropping slightly. "The report is incredibly thin. It's barely a page long. It just says, 'General goods,' no detailed manifest, no company of origin, nothing. For a ship that size, it's almost unheard of. It's like they wanted to close the book on it as quickly as possible." The lack of information was more telling than any detailed report could have been. In his line of work, Elias knew that brevity in official documents often served one purpose: to conceal the truth. "That sounds suspicious," he said. "It is," Lena agreed. "It feels incomplete. I'm going to keep digging, but for now, the only official record is of a simple cargo ship sinking in a storm." As they ended the call, Elias felt a mix of frustration and validation. They had a name, a date, a tangible event to anchor the mystery to. But it was a ghost story, with all the important details missing. He looked out the window. The tide was turning. It was almost time. He grabbed his jacket and headed outside, his mind racing. The Odyssey, 1983. A K-9 soldier. The pieces were floating, but they refused to connect. He stood on the bluff overlooking the shore, watching as Echo appeared, a gray and white specter against the dark, wet rocks. The dog went to its usual spot and began to dig, the rhythm of its work a familiar, comforting sight. Today, the object it pulled from the sea was different. It was a larger piece of metal, a flat plate, perhaps from the hull of a ship or a large piece of equipment. It was heavy, and Echo had to adjust its grip several times before it could lift it properly. As the dog turned, the weak sunlight caught the surface of the plate. Elias saw something on it. A marking. His heart began to pound. He waited, forcing himself to be patient as Echo completed its ritual. The moment the dog was gone, Elias half ran, half slid down the steep path to the cemetery. He went straight to the sailor statue. There, lying atop the other fragments, was the metal plate. It was a piece of aluminum alloy, remarkably resistant to corrosion, and etched into its surface was a logo. Most of it had been scraped away by rocks and time, but a portion was still clear, a stylized eagle's wing cradling a series of 3 wavy lines. It was a corporate logo, clean and precise. He had never seen it before. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling slightly with the cold. He took several pictures from different angles, making sure the remaining part of the logo was sharp and clear. He immediately sent them to Lena with a simple message: "Echo's fine today. Look familiar?" He did not have to wait long. His phone buzzed less than a minute later. It was a text from Lena. "Where did you get this?" He replied, "I just told you, Echo." Another buzz. "Call me." Now, he hit the call button. Lena picked up on the first ring. "Elias, that logo," she said, her voice tight with a new kind of urgency, an edge of fear. "I know that logo. I've seen it in historical business journals from the 1982nd. "Who is it?" Elias asked, his gaze fixed on the strange symbol at his feet. "It's the old logo for Aegis Dynamics," she said. "They're a massive tech corporation now, but back then they were one of the biggest defense contractors in the country. They didn't make general goods, Elias. They specialized in one thing: advanced experimental sonar technology for the U.S. Navy." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Elias looked from the logo at his feet out toward the restless gray water where the Odyssey had gone down. A defense contractor, experimental sonar, a military K-9 unit. "Lena," he said slowly, the pieces finally slamming into place. "The Odyssey was no cargo ship." "No," she whispered back over the phone. "It wasn't." The revelation that the Odyssey was a vessel for Aegis Dynamics changed everything. The silence on the phone line after Lena's declaration was heavy, filled with the weight of a 40-year-old secret that had just been disturbed. The mystery was no longer a sad, local tragedy. It had expanded, taking on the sinister shape of a military cover-up. "Elias, what does this mean?" Lena's voice was a low whisper, the excitement of the historian replaced by a dawning apprehension. Elias stared out at the gray sea, his mind, honed by years of threat assessment, already calculating the new variables. "It means we are no longer just looking into the past," he said, his own voice grim. "We are poking at something that someone, a very powerful someone, wanted to stay buried." "Lena, how did you access the information about the shipwreck?" "I filed a formal records request with the State Archives for the full, unredacted report on the Odyssey, citing my credentials as a local historian," she explained. "It's standard procedure, but given the lack of detail in the town's copy, I wanted to see the original file." Elias's blood ran cold. It was a logical step for a researcher, but a potentially fatal one in this new context. "You've put us on their radar," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "Aegis Dynamics is a massive corporation. They'll have systems in place, digital tripwires. A request for a sensitive, sealed file from 1983 about a ship they tried to erase from history? They know, Lena. They know someone is looking." A heavy silence followed. "What do we do?" she finally asked, her voice small. "For now, nothing. We lay low, we wait, and we watch. Let me know if you hear anything back from the archives, and be careful." The waiting was the hardest part. For the next few days, an uneasy quiet settled over Port Blossom. The fog rolled in and out, the tides rose and fell, and Echo performed his daily ritual with the same solemn dedication. But for Elias, the familiar landscape now felt different. He watched the horizon not for its bleak beauty, but for any sign of something out of place. Every passing car on the distant coastal road, Every fishing boat leaving the harbor was now a potential threat. His self-imposed isolation had become a tactical position. The lighthouse was no longer a refuge. It was an observation post. The first sign came 4 days after his call with Lena. Elias had driven into town for supplies, a necessary trip he now regarded with deep suspicion. Port Blossom's Main Street consisted of the general store, a post office, and a small diner. The vehicles parked along it were a familiar collection of aging pickup trucks and practical sedans, all bearing the patina of salt and sea air. All except one. It was a black sedan, a late model, impeccably clean, with tinted windows. It bore an out-of-state license plate from Virginia. In a place like Port Blossom, it stood out like a hawk in a flock of pigeons. Elias parked his truck and watched the car in his rearview mirror. 2 men sat inside. He could not see their faces clearly through the tinted glass, but their posture was rigid, their attention focused on the town's slow, meandering activity. They were not tourists. They were waiting. Elias got out of his truck and walked into the general store, his senses on high alert. The bell above the door chimed, and Martha looked up from behind the counter, giving him a small, tight smile. The 2 men from the sedan were at the back of the store, pretending to look at a display of fishing lures. They were both dressed in dark, functional clothing that was too new, too clean for this town. One was thick-set and balding. The other was leaner, with sharp, restless eyes. Elias grabbed a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread, moving to the counter. He could hear the men talking to Martha, their voices low and out of place. "We're just curious," the leaner man said, his tone attempting a casualness that did not reach his eyes. "We heard there's a guy who bought the old lighthouse. A newcomer." Martha's expression remained placid, but Elias could see the protective instinct flicker in her eyes. "Folks come and go," she said non-committally, ringing up Elias's items. "We also heard a strange story," the thick-set man added, "about a dog, a gray German shepherd that digs things up on the beach. Here. It is Lev." Elias's entire body went rigid. They knew. They knew about him, and they knew about Echo. His simple, quiet life had been breached. He was a target. Martha finished bagging his groceries. "This is a fishing town, mister, full of strange stories." She met Elias's eyes for a brief moment, a silent message of warning and solidarity passing between them. Elias paid, gave a curt nod, and walked out. The cool air outside did nothing to calm the fire that had just been lit in his gut. This was what he had run from, the feeling of being a target, the cold calculus of threat and response. As he walked to his truck, he felt their eyes on his back. He did not turn around. He did not need to. Years of training had taught him to feel a hostile gaze like a physical touch. He got into his truck and started the engine, his movements calm and deliberate. He pulled out onto the street and drove away, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. The black sedan did not follow. They were professionals. They would not be that obvious. But their presence in the town was a clear and unambiguous message. The secret of the Odyssey was not dead, and they were here to make sure it stayed buried, along with anyone who tried to unearth it. The danger was no longer a ghost from 1983. It was here, now, parked on Main Street. The drive back to the lighthouse was a tense, silent affair. Elias's mind was no longer his own. It had reverted to a state of hypervigilance he had not experienced since his last tour. Every car that passed, every shadow that moved in the periphery, was a potential threat. The moment he was back inside the stone walls of his fortress, he called Lena. "They're here," he said, his voice low and steady, stripped of all emotion. He recounted the encounter at the general store, the black sedan, the 2 men, their pointed questions about him and Echo. He heard Lena take a sharp breath on the other end of the line. "Elias, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "It's nobody's fault," he corrected her, his tone softening slightly. "You were doing your job. But now we know. The stakes are real. Stay at your uncle's place. Don't go back to your house alone. Don't talk to anyone you don't know. It is a mood. The next day passed with no sign of the black sedan. But its absence was more unnerving than its presence. It meant they were watching, waiting, choosing their moment. The call from Lena came late in the afternoon, but her voice was not filled with fear of their pursuers. It was strained with a different kind of worry. "It's Uncle Samuel," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's sick, a bad fever. He collapsed this morning. The doctor from the next town over came by. He said it's pneumonia. He's old, Elias, and he's so weak." "I'm sorry, Lena. Is there anything I can do?" "No, I have to stay here and take care of him. I don't know when I'll be able to continue with the research." "Don't worry about that," Elias said firmly. "Just look after your uncle." Lena spent the next 2 days by Samuel's bedside, tending to his fever and listening to his labored breathing. The small cottage felt heavy with unspoken history. On the third afternoon, while Samuel was sleeping, she decided to tidy the cluttered living room. Tucked away under a pile of old fishing nets in a dark corner was a small wooden sea chest bound with tarnished brass. It was not locked. Her historian's curiosity got the better of her. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest smelled of cedar and old paper. Inside, beneath a collection of maritime charts and a heavy brass compass, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and, beneath those, a photograph. It was a black and white photo of 2 young men in crisp Coast Guard uniforms, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a young, impossibly vibrant Samuel. The other man was just as young, with a kind, open face and eyes full of laughter. Tucked behind the photo was a single, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in her uncle's familiar, spidery handwriting, but it was unfinished. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed with age. It was dated December 1983. It began without a greeting. "He's gone. David is gone. The storm took the ship, and it took him with it. They're telling me to be quiet. They're telling me it was a cargo ship, that it was a tragic accident, but they're lying. I saw it. I saw what was on that deck before the last wave took her, and I saw his partner, standing beside him, loyal to the very end. I should have done more. The secret is too heavy. It's a weight that will pull me down into the dark with them." The letter ended there, the last sentence trailing off as if the writer's hand had been shaking too much to continue. Lena's hands were trembling now, too. David, that was the other man's name. And he had a partner. At that exact moment, miles away at the lighthouse, Elias was watching Echo. The tide was out, and the gray and white shepherd was digging with a familiar intensity. But today, its prize was not the hard glint of metal. It was something dark and soft. Echo pulled it from the sand, shook it once, and began its solemn walk toward the cemetery. A new sense of urgency propelled Elias. He felt a strange, certain feeling that this find was different, that it was important. He followed at a respectful distance. After Echo had made its offering and departed, Elias approached the sailor statue. Lying there, separate from the pile of metal fragments, was a piece of dark, salt-stiffened leather. It was cracked and rotting, but its shape was unmistakable. It was a section of a heavy-duty collar, the kind used for military working dogs. He stared at it, a cold dread mixing with a sense of profound revelation. The dog had been bringing back the ship, piece by piece. Now it was bringing back the soldier. He called Lena immediately. "Lena, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice low and intense. "Echo, it just brought back a piece of a K9 collar. Got him. Fine section to the nice." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Elias," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and sorrow. "I found something. A box. It belonged to my uncle." She read him the unfinished letter. As she spoke the words, "David is gone, and I saw his partner, standing beside him, loyal to the very end," all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud. The K9 tag belonged to David's partner. The man in the photograph, Samuel's best friend, was on the Odyssey. He was a K9 handler, and he did not go down alone. The ship was not just carrying a secret piece of technology, it was carrying a secret team. It was a tomb, not just for a ship, but for a man and his dog, a partnership of unwavering loyalty that a quiet, gray and white shepherd had refused to let the world forget. The phone call with Lena ended, but the connection between them seemed to linger in the air, thick with the weight of their discovery. David and his partner, a K9 handler and his dog, lost to the sea, and a 40-year-old conspiracy. For Elias, the story was no longer an abstract mystery. It had a face, a name, and a profound personal resonance that shook him to his core. It was Ghost's story, told in a different time, on a different sea. The grief he had carried for his own partner now intertwined with a fierce, protective anger for a man and a dog he had never known. He knew what was coming next. The men in the black sedan were not investigators. They were enforcers. Now that Elias and Lena had connected the Odyssey to a K9 unit, they had moved from being a nuisance to being a direct threat to the Aegis Dynamics cover-up. They would not wait for another records request. They would come to him. They would come to retrieve the evidence Echo had so diligently recovered, especially the K9 tag, and to silence the person who possessed it. His training took over, a cold, familiar calm settling over him. The Lighthouse, his chosen sanctuary, was now a defensive position. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. He was not a man with an arsenal, but he had his mind and an intimate knowledge of the old stone tower. He worked methodically, setting up a simple but effective early warning system. At the base of the main door, just inside, he carefully balanced a pyramid of empty tin cans on a loose floorboard. On the narrow, winding spiral staircase, he wedged a small metal bar into a crack in the stone, nearly invisible in the gloom, but perfectly placed to catch a boot and send a man tumbling. He moved a heavy oak table to create a bottleneck in the main living area. They were simple measures, but in the dark, against an overconfident enemy, they would be enough. He made one last call to Lena. "Stay with your uncle," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Lock the doors. Don't answer for anyone but me. Do you understand?" "Elias, what's happening?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. "They're coming," he said simply. "But they're coming for me, not you. Just stay put." He hung up before she could protest. This was his fight. Twilight, the time the Vietnamese call Chung Vang, descended on Port Blossom, blurring the edges of the world in a soft, gray light. Elias sat in the darkness of the lantern room, watching the coastal road. He did not need lights. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, could pick out the slightest movement. The black sedan appeared just as the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon. It parked a quarter-mile down the road, its lights off. Two figures emerged and began walking toward the lighthouse, moving silently through the encroaching dusk. Elias moved down the spiral staircase, his feet making no sound on the cold stone. He took up a position in the shadows of the main floor, a heavy iron fireplace poker in his hand. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, becoming a part of the tower's stillness. He heard the faint crunch of boots on the gravel outside. Then, silence. They were assessing the entrance. A moment later, a sharp metallic crack echoed through the room as the lock on the main door was forced. The door creaked open. The first man, the leaner of the two, stepped inside, a powerful flashlight cutting a swath through the darkness. He took 2 steps, then a third. The crash was deafening in the silence. His foot hit the loose floorboard, and the pyramid of tin cans clattered across the stone floor. A chaotic, metallic alarm. The man swore, startled, and the beam of his flashlight jerked wildly. In that split second of distraction, Elias moved. He exploded from the shadows, a blur of motion. He did not aim for the man's head. He brought the heavy poker down in a swift, disabling arc against the man's wrist. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning crazily. The man screamed, A sharp cry of pain cut short as Elias drove a shoulder into his chest, sending him stumbling back into his partner, who was just entering the doorway. The second, thick-set man, was momentarily tangled with his injured comrade. It was all the time Elias needed. He kicked the fallen flashlight, sending it skittering into a corner, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The men were disoriented, one of them now effectively out of the fight. "Who are you?" the thick-set man growled into the dark, trying to shove his partner aside. Elias did not answer. He used the sound of the man's voice to pinpoint his location. He moved silently along the wall, circling them. The thick-set man took a hesitant step forward, his boot catching on the leg of the heavy oak table Elias had positioned. He grunted in frustration, momentarily off balance. Elias struck again. He swung the poker in a low, powerful sweep, connecting solidly with the man's knee. The man roared in pain and collapsed, his leg buckling beneath him. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. One man was cradling a shattered wrist, the other was on the floor, unable to stand. Elias stood over them, his chest heaving slightly, the poker held ready. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Go back to your bosses at Aegis. Tell them the next people they send, I won't be so gentle. Tell them the story of the Odyssey is coming out. Now, go." Scrambling and groaning, the two men helped each other up and hobbled out of the lighthouse, disappearing into the night. Elias stood in the doorway, listening until the sound of their hurried retreat faded, replaced once more by the rhythmic crash of the waves. The immediate threat was gone. But he knew this was only the beginning. The attack had failed, but it had pushed everything to a point of no return. They knew he would fight, and he knew that the next time, Aegis Dynamics would not send 2 men, they would send an army. The adrenaline from the fight receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The lighthouse was no longer safe. It was a target, a fixed point on the enemy's map. Elias moved quickly, his actions precise and economical. He gathered the most critical pieces of evidence: the K9 tag, the fragment of the leather collar, and the metal plate bearing the Aegis Dynamics logo. He wrapped them in an old cloth and tucked them securely into the inner pocket of his leather jacket. He took one last look around the stone room, a place he had hoped would be a sanctuary, and walked out into the night, leaving the broken door swinging in the wind. He drove without lights until he was well away from the lighthouse, his truck, a dark shape, moving through the deeper darkness of the coastal road. When he arrived at Samuel's cottage, the windows were glowing with a warm, yellow light, a small beacon of defiance against the oppressive night. Lena threw the door open before he could knock, her face pale with worry. She threw her arms around him, a desperate, relieved hug that surprised them both. "Elias, I was so scared. I tried to call you back, but you didn't answer." "I'm all right, Lena," he said, his voice quiet but reassuring. "They're gone. For now." Over her shoulder, he saw Samuel. The old man was sitting up in a worn armchair by the fireplace, a thick blanket wrapped around his frail shoulders. His fever seemed to have broken, but the illness had stripped him of his bluster, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable sorrow. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Elias, and in them, Elias saw not anger, but a deep, weary resignation. "Tell me what happened," Samuel rasped, his voice thin but clear. Elias recounted the events of the evening, his words clipped and factual. He described the forced entry, the attack in the dark, and his final warning to the 2 men. As he spoke, a profound change came over Samuel. The weight of 40 years of silence seemed to become physically unbearable. The secret he had carried to protect himself, to protect his family, had now brought violence to their doorstep. The burden had finally become too heavy to carry alone. When Elias finished, Samuel closed his eyes for a long moment. A single tear traced a path through the deep wrinkles on his weathered cheek. "It's my fault," he whispered. "All of it. I should have spoken up in 1983. I should have honored him." "Uncle?" Lena knelt by his chair, her hand on his arm. Samuel's eyes opened, and he looked at Elias, a man he had initially dismissed, but a man he now recognized as a kindred spirit. "You were right," he said. "You said the dog was on a mission. You knew the look of it. I knew it too. I just tried to forget." And then, the story came pouring out, a torrent of memory and guilt held back for 4 decades. He told them about the storm, a monster of wind and water that had turned the sea into a churning nightmare. He was young then, part of a 2-man Coast Guard rescue boat that was the first to respond to the Odyssey's distress call. "She was a military vessel," Samuel said, his voice trembling with the memory. "Not a cargo ship. I could see the hardware on her deck, things I'd never seen before. She was listing badly, waves crashing over her. We got close, so close, and I saw him. David," he choked on the name, "my best friend. He was a K-9 handler, part of a special unit assigned to guard the ship's cargo. He was on the deck, trying to secure a crate. And his partner, a big, beautiful shepherd named Storm, was right there with him, refusing to leave his side." He paused, lost in the horror of the memory. A rogue wave hit her, a wall of black water. She rolled, and she was gone. Just like that. We searched for hours, but there was nothing. No survivors. The next day, men in suits from the government came. They told me what I saw was classified. They told me I would sign a report, stating the Odyssey was a civilian vessel, lost in the storm, or I would be charged with treason. I was young. I was scared. So, I signed the lie. Lena was crying softly, her head resting on her uncle's knee. Elias stood silent, his own heart aching with a shared grief. "But the sea remembers," Samuel continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The day after the wreck, Old Man Hemlock, a fisherman, found something washed up in a cove down the coast. A single, terrified shepherd pup, half drowned but alive. It was Storm's pup. She must have given birth on the ship. He knew David and I were close, so he brought the pup to me." That was the beginning of Echo's line. "He is the last living piece of the Odyssey." He looked at Elias, his eyes pleading for understanding. "The ritual, it's not a memory. It's instinct. That sonar prototype they were guarding, the crate David died for, it was built with a unique chemical compound, something to protect it from the pressure and the salt. The wreck has been leaking it, just a few molecules at a time, for 40 years. It has a scent, one that only a bloodline bred for tracking, a bloodline with a direct connection to that ship, could ever detect. Echo isn't haunted by a ghost, son. He's being summoned by the evidence. Have a now." The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The entire, tragic story was finally laid bare. They had it all. They had the motive from Aegis Dynamics. They had the physical evidence, recovered by the unwavering loyalty of a dog. And now, they had the eyewitness, a man who had carried the truth like a stone in his heart for a lifetime. Elias looked at the K-9 tag in his hand, then at the old man who had finally found the courage to speak. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they were not just 3 people against a faceless corporation. They were the keepers of a story, the voice for the dead, and they were ready to make the world listen. The night in Samuel's cottage was a long and sleepless one. They sat by the dying embers of the fire, the weight of the truth a tangible presence in the small room. With Samuel's confession, they held a story powerful enough to shake a nation, but they were 3 ordinary people against a corporation with limitless resources. The next step was the most dangerous. It was Lena, the historian, who knew the path forward. "We can't go to the local authorities," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "Aegis has had 40 years to bury this. Their influence will run deep. We need to go bigger. We need to go national." She knew a journalist, a respected investigative reporter for a major national newspaper, a man whose reputation was built on dismantling corporate and government cover-ups. It was a risk, but it was their only real chance to have the story heard. The next morning, Lena made the call. She laid out the story in a calm, factual tone. The shipwreck, the secret cargo, the K-9 unit, the eyewitness testimony, and the physical evidence recovered by a dog. The journalist listened, and the world began to change. The story broke a week later. It was the front-page headline, a bombshell that sent shockwaves from the quiet shores of Maine to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. The Odyssey's Secret: How a Dog Unearthed a 40-year-old Military Tragedy. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, weaving together Lena's meticulous research, the heartbreaking account of Samuel's testimony, and the incredible story of Echo's unwavering instinct. The photographs Elias had taken of the K9 tag and the Aegis logo were published for the world to see. The fallout was immediate and immense. Aegis Dynamics issued a flat denial, but the public outcry was deafening. Under immense pressure, the government was forced to reopen the investigation into the sinking of the Odyssey in 1983. The story of a fallen K9 handler and his partner, silenced for decades, captured the heart of the nation. For Elias, Lena, and Samuel, the following weeks were a whirlwind. They were no longer anonymous residents of a forgotten town. They were the keepers of David and Storm's story. Elias, who had sought only to disappear, found himself quietly and capably handling the press, his military calm serving him well. He spoke not of himself, but of the bond between a handler and his K9, a bond of loyalty that the sea itself could not break. The government investigation confirmed everything Samuel had said. Aegis Dynamics was found to have engaged in a massive cover-up, and the repercussions were severe. But for the three people at the heart of the story, the true victory came on a bright, clear autumn day. The small, windswept cemetery overlooking the water was filled with people. An honor guard in full-dress uniform stood at attention. A new memorial stone had been erected next to the old sailor statue. On it were carved the names of the men who had been lost on the Odyssey, their true service finally acknowledged. And at the top, given a place of special honor, was the name of Coast Guard Petty Officer David Jensen and his K9 partner, Storm. Samuel, dressed in his old Coast Guard uniform, stood straighter than he had in years. He placed a hand on the cold stone, his fingers tracing the letters of his friend's name, and the 40 years of guilt finally lifted from his shoulders. Lena stood beside him, her hand linked with Elias's. 5. Elias looked at the new memorial, his heart full. He thought of Ghost, and for the first time, the memory brought not a sharp stab of pain, but a gentle, bittersweet warmth. Here, in this place of honor, the sacrifice of all partners, human and canine, was finally understood. He was no longer running from his past. He had found a way to honor it. He had decided to stay. The lighthouse was not a fortress of forgetting anymore. It was simply home. The quiet he had once craved was now filled with the warmth of friendship and the promise of a future he had never expected. He found his peace not in the empty silence, but in the shared laughter with Lena, in the comfortable quiet of sitting with Samuel on the porch, and in the steady, comforting presence of the dog who had started it all. Later that week, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, the four of them walked the familiar path to the rocky outcrop. The tide was at its lowest ebb, exposing the dark, seaweed-covered stones. It was the time of the ritual. But the ritual was over. Echo walked calmly between Elias and Samuel. He did not run to the rocks. He did not dig. He simply sat on the bluff, his gray and white body relaxed, his intelligent eyes gazing peacefully out at the horizon. His mission was complete. The scent that had called to his bloodline for 40 years was just a part of the sea now, its story finally told. Elias sat on a smooth, weathered rock, Lena settling beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. Samuel stood nearby, a small, peaceful smile on his face. Elias reached down and stroked Echo's head, his fingers sinking into the dog's thick fur. The gray and white shepherd leaned into his touch, a quiet sigh of contentment escaping him. Here, at the edge of the continent, surrounded by the people who had become his family, Elias Vance was finally at peace. The ghosts had been laid to rest, and the dawn had finally come to Port Blossom. Sometimes, the deepest loyalty isn't spoken in words, but is carried on the wind and tide, a silent promise that refuses to be forgotten. It reminds us that love and duty can create echoes that last for generations, a truth that a quiet dog named Echo taught an entire town. If this story of a bond that outlasted the sea has touched your heart, we would be honored if you would share it. Your likes and comments let us know these tales matter, and by subscribing, you help us continue to give a voice to these silent heroes. Our next story is waiting for you right now on the screen.